is a professor from University of Vermont. I think Rocky already gave an introduction about him and his work, and he's going to be talking about evolutionary computing and dynamics and robotics and AI and very cool, interesting topics. So Josh, you're on.
Great. Thank you very much, and nice to meet you all. Before I get started, maybe just a little bit of housekeeping here. Can you see my slide okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you see yourselves or myself?
We are at the very top.
Okay.
At the very top.
Okay, that's fine. I do not see you, but I can hear you. So if you have any questions, don't raise your hand because I can't see your hand. Just shout out your question, and happy to take them as we go. Sound good?
Yeah, I'll take care of questions. So if somebody wants, I'll be looking.
That would be great. Thanks very much. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to talk about the three concepts you see here: morphology, evolution, and cognition, which happens to be the name of the lab that I run here at the University of Vermont. So I will introduce these three concepts and then also talk about how we can unite them to try and study any one of these concepts from a unique perspective that might be difficult to do otherwise. But before I talk about morphology, evolution, and cognition, I wanted to sort of set the stage first by talking about, give a very brief history of AI and robotics and where we are today, and use that to set the stage. And to do that, I'm going to use a series of geometric metaphors here. So imagine we have this one-dimensional vector here of performance. And we can imagine then that any point lying on this vector represents a robot, a neural network, an agent, a swarm, and we assume that that agent is trying to perform some task and it's doing better or worse. So a point that lies further to the right is doing better at the task than an agent that lies further to the left. As most of you know, for most of the history of AI, we hugged sort of the left hand, the base of this vector, where we're not able to do much better than chance. But thanks to the deep learning revolution and the big data revolution coming together, we've now made surprisingly fast progress in creating accurate machines. So if a point represents an agent, you can imagine a line segment that's embedded in this dimension as a machine learning algorithm that is creating a bunch of points on this line that hopefully are moving to the right. Of course, we can think about different kinds of agents, but also different kinds of tasks. And what we've learned so far in AI is that some tasks are easier than others. So in this little cartoon here, we have different machine learning algorithms, each represented by a vector here, which is the current state of the art in any one of these AI problems. And I sort of have this sequence here on the right-hand side with more difficult tasks towards the top, and we could argue about the ordering of these. But again, this is just meant to be a metaphor for sort of where we've been, where we are, and hopefully where we're going. One of the big challenges in machine learning at the moment is the concept of catastrophic forgetting. So we might be able to train an agent to be very good or very accurate at performing a given task or recognizing a certain pattern in data. But if we then expose that agent to a different task, which would represent a vector that's moving diagonally in this two-dimensional plane, it will typically become much worse, or it will forget the original task, and therefore this diagonal vector will start to curve to the left, and we will not be able to obtain an agent that's able to do more than one task well. So far, so good?
Yes.
Okay. There are those that argue that it's basically just a matter of more compute and more data, and we will eventually be able to achieve agents that do more and more tasks better and better. And some argue we may eventually get to artificial general intelligence, whatever that means. I'm not sure how far we will get, but we can start to think about this as a function of performance and tasks. For those of us that work in robotics, there is a third dimension, which is embodiment or morphology. We tend to use these terms interchangeably in my group. Like intelligence or adaptation, this is a very general term. It means a lot of different things to different people. So again, in this metaphor, I'm sort of introducing this third dimension of embodiment, and we'll sidestep the argument about what exactly embodiment means. But most people would agree that the Roomba vacuum cleaner you see down here at the lower left has a simpler or less embodiment than the Atlas humanoid robot that you see at the top right. So in this cube now, we assume, again, any point within this cube represents an agent or a robot. And the further towards the back of this cube that point is, the more complex its embodiment. And points that are trapped in the front facing face of this cube represent non-embodied agents like a neural network. So if those of us working in embodied AI, our approach is slightly different. Most of the algorithms we create are trying to push along this grand diagonal. And what does it mean to move along this grand diagonal? It means a class of training algorithms that are trying to improve the performance of a set of agents. It is possibly exposing that population of agents to an increasingly large set of tasks as we go. And in a small set of these experiments, we are also pushing from the front of the cube towards the back, where the actual embodiment of the agents over the lifetime of the training algorithm are changing. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So this is just to sort of contrast two different approaches to AI, this one and this one. And we'll sort of talk about the pros and cons of these as we go. As we all know, collectively as a field, we've made some amazing progress in just the last few years. This is a tweet from Andrej Karpathy at Google. This is a very short summary, as you can see, of a pretty amazing experiment. Google trained 7 robot arms over 4 months. Each of these robot arms were trading neural networks, and training those networks had 1.2 million parameters. They started from a hand-designed set of initial conditions, and collectively these 7 arms performed 580,000 grasp attempts. The only sensor data was raw red, green, blue camera input. And after those 4 months, they were able to obtain 96 success rate when these arms were exposed to objects they had not seen before. So an incredibly impressive feat at the time. But if you think about the training algorithm here, this training algorithm is moving an agent, which you can think of as this collection of 7 robot arms, as if you like, from the left to the right. They get better and better at a given task, which is object manipulation. However, these agents were trapped within this this one-dimensional vector. There was no additional tasks that they were exposed to over these 4 months. And the morphology or the embodiment of these arms themselves did not change over the 4 months. These were clearly fixed robots throughout this period. So in my group and some other groups, we asked the question about, again, what happens, what are some additional questions about cognition or some novel approaches to AI that open up when we think about breaking this assumption that the robot's body stays fixed over the training algorithm, and we start to move along all 3 or maybe 2 of these dimensions at the same time. So that's morphology for the moment. And although these robots are embodied, in the Google case, the embodiment is not changing. So the experiments that I'm going to talk about today from my group and some other groups, in all of these experiments, in some way, the morphology itself is changing over the training period. Okay, so let's move from morphology then to evolution. Most of the training algorithms that allow for change in body plan are evolutionary algorithms rather than reinforcement learning tasks or backpropagation, some of the other ones you may be familiar with. There's lots of videos we could choose from. I chose this one. This is work by Nick Cheney that was done in Hod Lipson's group a few years ago. And they're going to evolve robots in simulation. And these robots are made up of these 4 kinds of materials you see here. And these 4 materials are color-coded. So the red and green voxels that you see here, you can think of these as muscle cells. They are contracting and expanding. The red voxels contract whenever the green voxels expand and vice versa. So this is like agonist and antagonistic muscle. They work complementary to one another. You'll see in some of these evolving robots, in some cases they have small amounts of light blue voxels. This is soft passive tissue. So this is sort of the robot equivalent of fat or ligament. And in some cases, you see a little bit of dark blue voxels, and this is hard passive material, the soft robot equivalent of bone or support structure. You can see that what you're seeing here is a snapshot of different robots. Here's the best one at the end of this evolutionary algorithm. Each of these robots clearly has a different morphology. They have different geometries. And they also have different distributions of material properties. So the evolutionary process is not just sculpting the control of these robots, but also their morphology. So the morphology of any one of these robots does not change over its lifetime, but the morphology of the best robot in the population at any given time is changing. You can see a number of interesting things in this video. Sometimes you see body plans that are kind of familiar. You might see some 2-legged or 4-legged robots that have bilateral symmetry. Obviously, most moving land-based animals on Earth have a bilaterally symmetric body plan. So artificial evolution often rediscovers things that Mother Nature has already discovered, but then we often sometimes also get non-intuitive designs as well. So evolutionary algorithms are a great tool to explore this kind of design space. One of the nice things about applying evolutionary algorithms to soft robots, for example, is it's extremely difficult to apply traditional robotics design paradigms to this substrate. Things like forward and inverse kinematics don't really make a lot of sense here. This is a very non-intuitive design space, which is where evolutionary algorithms tend to excel. I'll pause there. Are there any questions?
What I mean, just for clarification, what would you say? What do you mean the difference between these evolutionary algorithms and the current reinforcement learning developments?
Right. So there's a number of differences. The first one is that we're usually dealing with a non-convex optimization problem. We assume a large number of local optima. So we need to have some sort of stochastic search method. Evolutionary algorithms usually are population-based. So most of these training algorithms are designed to try and find subsets of solutions that exist in different parts of the design space. So in this example here, they're showing just the best individual in the population at any given time, but there are also different species within this population that have discovered different local optima and are exploring those at the same time. Another difference, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, is that evolution makes it these evolutionary algorithms make it easy for us to optimize at different time scales. So it might make sense, for example, to have different parts of the robot adapting at different time scales. So for example, we might have an evolutionary algorithm which, like in this case, is designing the geometry and the material properties of the robot's body. We're also using the same evolutionary algorithm to design the control policy, but a lot of recent work in this field has swapped out the inner evolutionary algorithm for, again, reinforcement learning. So an interesting question in the field at the moment is, can evolution discover a morphology which facilitates reinforcement learning within the robot given that body plan. So they're not really antagonistic algorithms, which is the primary way they were viewed in the 90s and 2000s. More recent thinking is how to combine the complementary abilities of these different kinds of search methods.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
More questions?
No?
By the way, this is what I mentioned, just the 3D cell automata. Essentially.
There's one.
I'm sorry, Hiroki, I couldn't quite catch that.
Oh yeah, you may want to come over here. Right?
Come over here.
Thank you.
You can talk to the computer.
How much of the difference in, say, when the robot increases, is it more a matter of organization versus, say, instead of just growing in the red muscle, is it just moving where the red muscle is located? Like, is that the major difference between a high-performing robot and a lower-performing one?
That's a great question. So I think I might actually, just given that question, let me skip ahead and I'll come back again. I can talk a little bit more about the details of how this actually works. So this is the evolutionary algorithm that we're using to design these robots is known as a CPPN, or a compositional pattern producing network. CPPNs were invented by Ken Stanley, and we've adapted CPPNs here to create these robots. The basic idea here is we assume that we want to construct any one robot within a certain volume, which is represented by the empty cage that you see here. In order to build the robot, we take a CPPN, like the one that you see here on the left, which, as the second N represents, is a network. Assume we have a population of these CPPNs. Each CPPN creates a different robot. What CPPNs typically do is paint regular structures inside a Cartesian space, which in this case is going to be a three-dimensional Cartesian space. So the three input neurons to this network are X, Y, and Z. So we start by visiting certain locations in this empty cage, for example, X equals 0, Y equals 0, and Z equals 0. We feed those values to the input layer of the CPPN, and then we interpret the values arriving at the output layer of the CPPN as build instructions. So there's lots of different ways you can do that. In this case here, we have two output neurons. The first one we clamp to be a binary value, and if that binary value happens to be 0, no voxel is placed at that location. If it's a 1, a voxel is placed at that location. The second output neuron is clamped to an integer 1, 2, 3, or 4, which represents if a voxel is placed at that position, which of the 4 material properties that voxel takes on. Make sense? Okay, so we then visit X equals 0, Y equals 0, Z equals 1. We go to the next position, feed those input coordinates in, paint or place or don't place a voxel at that position, and continue. So a CPPN will, in that way, build up both the geometry and the material distribution of the robot. To address your question, how does evolution tend to change these things over time to realize increased fitness? And it turns out there's no simple answer to that question. You have a very indirect mapping here between the CPPN, which is the genotype in this case, and the soft robot on the right, which is the phenotype. If you imagine mutating any of the nodes or synapses in the CPPN, it's going to alter the kind of pattern that's produced. And typically that alteration is global. So mutating the CPPN typically doesn't move a red voxel or place a red voxel in one location where there wasn't one before. There are more subtle global changes. And the reason why is that CPPNs were originally invented to approximate biological development. So a mutation in biological DNA, most mutations don't affect one small part of the phenotype in space and time, like, for example, changing eye color. There are a few genes that do operate in that way, but most genes perturb the developmental trajectory of the organism, leading to subtle but global changes to the body as a whole. So it turns out it's very difficult to say how evolution is moving through this design space to find these highly fit robots. It's an open question for research at the moment. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So again, I don't want to go too deep into evolutionary algorithms. They've been around for a long time. Just wanted to sort of give you an idea about how we use them to design morphology and control. I'll move on now to cognition. This is an experiment we did a number of years ago with Victor Zykov and Hod Lipson. And the idea here was to study a particular aspect of cognition, which is internal modeling. So for organisms and robots alike, it often makes sense for them to internally rehearse an action before performing it in reality, because that action may be dangerous or even fatal. Better to think about stepping off the edge of a cliff than actually trying it out in reality. Clearly that makes sense from a Darwinian point of view, but how actually to realize this in machines was an open problem and still is to some degree. So in this particular experiment here, we took a physics engine, which you see in the top left. So we have our simulated robots, and we're going to evolve morphologies again, but in this case, we're going to be the robot is going to be evolving morphologies. And the fitness of any one morphology is how well it explains the current experiences of the robot. And again, in the interest of time, I don't think I'm going to go into the details of this, but just to sort of show you how this works. Let me start again here. We have the physical robot performing in the lower right, and it's feeding back sensor data into the simulation. And the simulation is being used by an evolutionary algorithm to try out different morphologies. And you'll see towards the end of this video that the evolutionary algorithm discovers a more or less accurate description of the physical robot. So again, like the previous video that I showed you, what I'm showing you here is a series of snapshots from an evolutionary process. The way in which the evolutionary algorithm knows that any one of these candidate morphologies is correct is that when the simulated robot moves, it produces simulated sensor data, which is close to the physical sensor data generated by the robot. So again, here now I'm describing to you an algorithm. Again, in this geometric metaphor, this would be a vector that's moving horizontally through this cube. We're not posing new tasks for this robot to perform, but it is getting better at modeling itself, and the embodiment is changing. The physical embodiment is not changing, which is the physical robot, but its understanding of self its imagined morphology is changing. And one of the reasons I wanted to use this experiment to illustrate this concept is that embodiment is not the same thing as physicality. You can have an agent up here which is non-physical, but it is embodied. And so what's the difference between these? Again, embodiment is sort of a controversial topic, but generally speaking, something that is embodied has agency. It can push against its environment, even if that environment is simulated, and the robot can observe the sensory repercussions of its action. A neural network that is looking for patterns in data has limited agency. It may or may not be able to request a new photograph. It probably can't go out in the world and take a new photograph of whatever it's trying to recognize, let alone obtain sensor data from other sources other than its camera, unless it's enabled to do so by a human investigator. So that's embodiment. As I mentioned, there's a reason why organisms and robots want to be able to mentally rehearse actions before performing them in reality, because again, they may be dangerous. So in the second phase of this experiment, we mechanically separated part of the physical robot's leg, which you can see here. The robot doesn't know that it's been separated. The The robot doesn't know that its leg has been separated, but it's getting new sensor data that it's using to tune its understanding of self. So the robot, after a while, or the evolutionary algorithm discovers that the physical robot is now a 3.5-legged robot rather than a 4-legged robot. So again, this is just an illustration that when you start to relax the assumption that morphology or embodiment stays fixed over a period of time, new avenues to approach questions in cognition and AI start to open up, like in this case, how to enable a robot to generate models of self. Any questions about that before I move on? So
No,
far,
it's
so
okay.
good?
Good. Go on.
Okay. All right. So that's research, and just in the spirit of the winter school here, I wanted to introduce a few software tools for those of you that might be interested in trying out some of these ideas yourself. We have a GitHub repository for PyroSim. This is sort of a robot, Python robot wrapper around a physics engine, so our Python robot simulator. We designed PyroSim to make it very easy to start to carry out some of these experiments on your own. PyroSim does not contain an evolutionary algorithm, so we don't make any assumptions about the form of optimization you want to perform. We just make it easy to construct different kinds of morphologies and environments in simulation. So I thought I'd just take a few minutes and just sort of show you the basic idea. So PyroSim is basically a package you can import into Python, and you can create a simulation object with just 3 lines of code that you see here. The constructor, we start up the simulation, which then starts running on your computer, and it comes with a whole bunch of graphics, so you can sort of play around with this in real time, and then eventually the simulation finishes. And that's about it. So the simulation object sort of just gives you back an empty world or an empty palette in which you can start to then add material. So the basic programming logic behind PyroSim is to think of this as sort of like a big Lego set. Now that you have this empty virtual world, you can start to place various kinds of elements into this world. The first element that's available to you are physical objects. So in this case, we're adding just a single line of code. And creating a cylinder, sending a cylinder to the simulator, which places a cylinder at the origin. And when we turn on the physics, this happens, which you'll see in a moment. So if you have any experience with physics engines, you'll know why this happens. We started by placing the object physically embedded in the floor plane. Physics engines will try and push objects that are not supposed to be connected apart. So the basic underlying logic of a physics engine is you define the geometry and mass properties of all of the objects, and then the physics engine will compute all the forces for you and animate all of the objects. So sometimes you get some surprising behavior like you see here. So that's objects. In the next example, we're going to add a second object, a second cylinder. And then we're going to connect these 2 cylinders together with a hinge joint. So now we're creating a simulator, sending 2 objects to the simulator, and sending a joint which connects these 2 objects together. And you can see the visualization of the joint here. In this case, this joint is operating like your elbow or your knee joint, and it connects these 2 objects together so that they can only rotate relative to one another. At this point, the agent has no agency, it has no motors and no sensors, so it's basically a passive rag doll. It just falls and is beholden to gravity and friction and inertia. The next thing we can add or send to the simulator are various kinds of sensors. So in this case, I'm sending a touch sensor, which is embedded in object 1, which is a cylinder. Next thing is I'm going to send a sensor neuron, and that sensor neuron is connected to the touch sensor. So whenever object 1 comes into contact with the ground, the touch sensor fires. The touch sensor sends a signal to the sensor neuron. We can then create a motor neuron, and that motor neuron is connected to the knee joint. So whatever value arrives at the motor neuron, that's translated into a desired torque that is sent to the joint. But at the moment, the sensor neuron and the motor neuron are not connected. So if we were to run all of this code, we'd basically get the same thing. We'd get this passive ragdoll robot. So the last piece we need to add is a synapse, and that synapse is going to connect sensor neuron S to motor neuron M, and we can supply a weight for that synapse. And now we have all of the basic elements of a robot. We have objects, we have joints that connect those objects together and constrain the relative motion of those objects. We have various kinds of sensors, and then inside that robot we can create neural networks of arbitrary topology by sending different neurons and different synapses to connect them up. If we take this code and we run this in PyroSim now, you get the following. Which is a very odd form of locomotion, but locomotion nonetheless. Why do we get this particular form of movement? Anybody have an idea? So there's a touch sensor embedded in this object here, and whenever this touch sensor fires, it's sending a signal along the synapse to the motor that's connected to the joint in here. So whenever the touch sensor is 1, or that object is in contact with the ground, it sends positive torque, which expands the angle, or it increases the angle between the two objects, which causes the front object to move forward, and that lunge forward kind of pulls the back leg off the ground for a short period of time. And when that back object leaves the ground for that short period of time, the touch sensor stops firing, which sends negative torque to the joint and constricts the angle between them. So we get a feedback loop that runs forward from the touch sensor to the sensor neuron to the motor neuron through the synapse and then out to the world, but then the embodiment of the agent closes the loop. The moment that the agent moves, that causes a change in mass distribution and torque and inertia, which causes change in motion of the objects, which in some cases causes change in the sensor value. So again, as I mentioned before, embodiment sculpts the way in which movement causes different kinds of sensory repercussion. So even with this 10 or 12 lines of code, we have a fully embodied agent, and we can change the embodiment or the neural network or both and see what kind of impacts that has on behavior. Or we can start to take various parameters or parts of this code and place them under control of an evolutionary algorithm or a learning algorithm and allow it to automatically iterate through different designs and optimize against some performance metric. So for those of you that are interested in trying this out, you can see there's a relatively shallow learning curve. It's relatively easy to get started and play around with various ideas. Next thing I want to mention is my group also runs an online course called Ludobots, and we run this through reddit.com. There's the URL. The first class, quote unquote, is going to start next week on Tuesday. So if you haven't had enough school at the end of the winter school, please come join us at Ludobots. I teach an evolutionary robotics class here at the University of Vermont starting next Tuesday, and so my UVM students work alongside any other online students that sign up and take the course. We use PyroSim as our primary teaching tool in this course. So again, if you're interested, come join us next Tuesday.
Just one question.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you need to install any separate physics engine to run this?
No, you don't. If you can, PyroSim comes with Open Dynamics Engine, which is all embedded within PyroSim. So the GitHub repo has all the instructions about how to install everything. And for most platforms, it takes about 10, 15 minutes to install.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay, so I thought I would just talk about some other projects. So again, there was a question about the difference between evolution and learning. One of the nice things about evolution is it often, evolution as a whole combines adaptation that occurs at different timescales. Most learning algorithms that I'm familiar with usually have one sort of timescale at which learning or adaptation occurs at. Evolution combines lots of different timescales. The slowest timescale is obviously evolution itself, where in nature we see gradual changes to body plans and nervous systems of animals over time. However, evolution sets an adaptation process that occurs at a faster time scale, which is development. So any one organism also experiences morphological and neurological changes over its lifetime. And the playing out of those two changes is set by evolution. So a mutation to DNA usually doesn't change a static structure. It changes the way in which structures grow over the lifetime of an organism. So if we put those two ideas together, evolution and development, you have the field of evo-devo in biology. So Sam Kriegman is one of my PhD students, and he's sort of studying what we tongue-in-cheek call robo-evo-devo. And what I'm going to show you now is a video which is actually a tweet that captures one of these robo-evo experiments, and I'll try and walk through this gradually. Again, we're back to these simulated soft robots, and the first robot that you're seeing here is just a random robot at the beginning of the evolutionary process, not doing very much. But after a few generations, this robot evolves into this robot. What evolution is doing in this case is actually dictating changes that occur at there's the slow evolutionary time scale and then also the morphological time scale. So it's very difficult to see in this robot or in this robot, but their bodies are actually changing slightly. The size of these voxels is actually being dictated, or the way in which the size of these voxels changes over the lifetime of the robot is being dictated by evolution. And you can see that a little more clearly in this third robot. So the second robot produces this descendant, which towards the end of its lifetime discovers rolling. So this robot compresses the posterior voxels to the point where eventually it rolls over itself. And I'll play this robot again. And you'll notice that it discovers it just at the end of its lifetime, and at that time, during that rolling process, it actually moves slightly faster than it did the rest of its lifetime. So there's a bit of an acceleration. There's sort of this little fitness bump that occurs at the end of this robot's lifetime. This third robot, again, one of its descendants is this fourth robot, which now exhibits rolling earlier in its lifetime and travels further. I sort of gave away the punchline there. The fourth robot there discovers rolling earlier, and then its descendant, the fifth one that you're going to see in a moment, genetically canalizes this phenotype, or that's a fancy way of saying that it discovers and implants this in the DNA so that it's there from the beginning. And because of that, it's able to travel faster than any of its ancestors. So by combining evolution and development, we're kind of rediscovering what's known as the Baldwin effect. This has been studied a fair bit actually in AI and robotics already. This is just a sort of an obvious way of viewing it. The Baldwin effect is the idea that if you combine two timescales of adaptation, in this case evolution and development, they often synergize. So in this case, the developmental program, the change in the robot's body is sweeping through a local part of the design space. It's in essence trying out a bunch of different body plans one after the other. And by sweeping over a small space rather than occupying one position, which would be a fixed body plan, it stumbles, or one of these robots eventually stumbles on a new part of design space, which is the rolling part of the fitness landscape here. And by discovering it late in its lifetime, it turns out that there are lots of mutations. There turns out to be lots of paths, or it makes it relatively easy for evolution to move the phenotype slightly so that that rolling phenotype is discovered earlier, like you saw in the fourth robot, and then eventually it's locked in and it's discovered this rolling gait. In the paper that we cite here, in the control experiment, we removed development but used exactly the same evolutionary algorithm. And that impoverished evolutionary algorithm very rarely finds this rolling gait. So this rolling gait, at least in this experiment, is sort of a needle in the haystack, and the Baldwin effect makes it easier to find these needles in these haystacks. Okay. One other project I wanted to talk about that again combines morphology, evolution, and cognition is a recent project we've been working on that addresses the acquisition of language in machines. English language is very difficult for machines to understand because of something that's known as the symbol grounding problem. So if I were to give you, assuming you don't know how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs, if I were to give you a dictionary of words that are described using Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the definition of any one hieroglyph is given in Egyptian hieroglyphs, so basically it's an Egyptian to Egyptian dictionary, you'd have a hard time understanding what any one hieroglyph means because it's defined as a function of other hieroglyphs which you also don't understand. So you might go look up those hieroglyphs, which will take you to another part of the book in which there is yet another hieroglyph, and around you go. A robot that's exposed to a natural language like English or Mandarin basically has the same problem. It circles around and around, trying to define one term as a function of others, and can never really ground its understanding of any one word in that language. One way to solve the symbol grounding problem is through embodiment. So imagine we have a robot and it has some pressure sensors in the soles of its feet, and there are some human trainers, and those humans will issue the symbol JUMP to the robot whenever the robot jumps. From the robot's point of view, it discovers that there's a correlation between drop in pressure on the soles of its feet and the appearance of this symbol JUMP. So if you were then to turn around and ask this robot what JUMP means, it would show you that it knows what it means by jumping or by minimizing the pressure on the soles of its feet. In theory, and this has not been done yet, a robot should be able to ground what's known as a motoric word, like jump. So a motoric word is something that is clearly grounded in the physical experience of the organism, or in our case, the robot. If it can ground jump in physical experiences, it might be able to recursively ground a slightly more abstract word like movement in words it's already grounded. So if the robot is able to ground motoric words like jump, move, stop, stay still, turn left, turn right, it might be able to see that this new symbol, MOVEMENT, always appears during jump, move forward, turn left, turn right, but doesn't appear whenever it's issued the word stop. So you can continue this, and then it's sort of a fun experiment to talk about over beers, which is how far you could actually go with this. How abstract a concept could a robot actually recursively ground ultimately in its physical experience? That's the idea. Any questions?
Yes.
Earlier, we heard from Stuart Kaufman he told us about the theory of adjacent possible, which it sounds like a lot is happening here, where the robot, say it learns jump and a few other words that if it followed the same logic, that there would be a point at which it kind of experiences a hockey stick growth in the number of concepts it maybe can understand or can reformulate. And I wasn't sure if that was like or related to what was happening in this kind of learning.
Actually, that's a great question. So everything I've talked about here with language is still sort of more or less theoretical. In theory, it seems like it would work. And the connection with the adjacent possible, I think, according to Stu's interpretation of it, would fit here, because a robot that understands jump, there is a near infinite number of other English words that are not groundable using jump. And there may be only a few, like movement, that are. And how does the robot go about selecting that or choosing which of all these nearly infinite number of symbols to try and ground next? Assuming that this would work, maybe there would be a hockey stick or exponential growth in the number of terms the robot is able to ground. These are all great research questions. What I wanted to show you next is an experiment we have running on the web called Twitch Plays Robotics. You can just Google that, and it's running live at the moment. You can go and try it yourself. This is basically a sort of a human-computer interaction experiment to build an interface that would allow people and robots to work together to try and solve the symbol grounding problem. I'll show you the video in a moment, but before I start the video, let me just orient you. So what we have is, again, we have a physics engine here, and we have a virtual robot. We run the simulation here at UVM, and then we live stream the simulation to the Twitch website. And it's shown to the crowd. At this particular point that we took the video, there were 28 people watching our stream. So those 28 people are observing this purple robot. And at this point, this robot has been issued a command from the crowd, and that command happens to be "so close." Someone in chat said "so close," and that happened to become the word that the robot heard, which, as far as I know, is going to be a pretty difficult term for the robot to ground in its sensor motor experience. Up here in this panel here, the crowd is currently voting for which command or symbol they would like to try and get the robot to ground next. And there's currently 10 votes for crawl forward. And it turns out that crawl forward is an easily groundable symbol by this robot. It can generate sensor data that clearly correlates with this symbol. For example, if it moves forward, it has an accelerometer which is reporting positive acceleration in the y direction from the robot's point of view. If the accelerometer reports negative y values, then it's moving backwards, and most people give negative reinforcement in that case. Okay, I'll start up the video now. This has been greatly sped up so you can sort of see what's happening. We're actually exposing the crowd to different robots with different morphologies. There is the worm robot that we started with, and also this four-legged robot. I'll just see if I can stop it here at a particular point. If I can. Okay, so at this point in time, there's this blue robot, and the blue robot has been issued the command walk forward. And people can then type in positive and negative reinforcement. So at this point in time, 4 people had supplied negative reinforcement for this particular robot, and 0 people had provided positive reinforcement. Here's the blue robot. It's actually pointing backwards. So it's whatever it's doing, it's clearly not walking forward, which is down and to the left. And so the robot is getting a pretty clear signal in this case about whether it's succeeding or failing. This whole process is then embedded in what's known as an actor-critic model. So the actor in this case is the robot, and the critic is a neural network which is trying to find correlations between the robot's sensor data, the symbol, which in this case is walk forward, and reinforcement from the crowd. And if it can find a connection between all those, in the future, if the crowd issues the command walk forward again, and the robot starts moving and starts generating sensor data, the critic, the neural network, can predict whether or not the crowd will think that the current action is walk forward or not. So in the Twitch Plays Robotics project, we're again bringing together morphology, evolution, and cognition. We're doing a lot of evolution here. It turns out that the morphology of the robot, its very body plan, influences which symbols it's able to ground. If it's got a more complex morphology, it's harder to find correlations between sensor motor experience and these symbols. If it has a simpler morphology, it's easier to find these correlations. But if the morphology is too simple, some commands don't make sense. So for example, reach toward an object doesn't make sense to a robot that has no arm or no way to reach. So this is basically some research infrastructure we've developed to try and tackle this issue of how exactly a machine would go about solving the symbol grounding problem. I've got about 10 minutes left. I'm happy to leave some time for questions or maybe talk about one more experiment.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Okay. So the last one I want to talk about, this is some recent work together with Nick Cheney, Vitas Sunspiral at NASA, and Hod Lipson, which is addressing some of the algorithmic challenges in optimizing morphology and control together. So it turns out that this is a notoriously difficult problem, and part of the reason why learning algorithms have focused on training just neural networks and not trying to design robot bodies along with them. So again, I'll show you a little cartoon here to show you why it's so difficult for an optimization process to improve body and brain at the same time. Imagine we have this hypothetical bipedal walker here, which you see in gray, and inside that body there is some neural network represented with neurons as circles and arrows as synapses. So we have body and brain. Assume that an optimization process makes a change to the body, but not the brain. So there's lengthening of the legs. That's a mutation, for example. If there is no corresponding change in the controller, then the longer-legged robot is probably going to fall over, or it's going to disrupt whatever the previous robot was able to do, and its fitness will be lower, which is represented by the gray arrow here. What we would like to do is allow the controller to discover a complementary change which will take advantage of the opportunity of longer legs. And if it's able to do so, then it might be able to realize a robot that travels faster than its grandparent did in this case. There's lots of different ways that this has been tried in the past. None have really worked very well. I'm going to show you an approach that Nick came up with that seems to work quite well. He did not apply this to bipeds. He applied this to these soft robots that I showed you before. Again, we have these CPPNs, and just to remind you, a CPPN paints regular structure within a three-dimensional space in this case. What Nick did was to create a genome, and inside that genome are two CPPNs. CPPN 1 paints the morphology in the way that I described before. It dictates where voxels are placed, and it also colors those voxels with different colors, and those colors represent whether the voxel is active, which is red, muscle, or passive, which is the light blue. So this is sort of fatty or ligament structure, if you like. The second CPPN then passes over this morphology and paints a controller onto that robot. In this case, CPPN 2 is painting an open loop controller, which means it's just dictating frequency and phase offset of the oscillating red muscle voxels. So we've got two separate CPPNs. If there is a mutation that hits CPPN 1, it will change the body, but not change the control. It might change it a little bit because the control is now being painted onto a different body. However, if a mutation hits CPPN 2, but does not hit CPPN 1, then we have a robot that has exactly the same body as its parent, but it has a slightly different controller. What then happens is, imagine we have, again, a population of paired CPPNs, like you see here, and whenever CPPN 1 is mutated, it's protected for a few generations. So going back to my cartoon example here, imagine we have this robot and it suffers a mutation to CPPN 1, which changes the body but not the brain. This robot is protected for a few generations from deletion. We're able to produce produce a few offspring which may have control mutations in them. And if one of those descendants realizes an improvement over the grandparent, then this grandchild is kept around and the grandparent is deleted. So as the name of this paper implies, we're going to protect candidate morphological innovations for a short period of time. This actually had a very dramatic impact on the evolutionary algorithm's ability to optimize control and morphology together. This is the control case in which there is no morphological protection. I'll walk you through this plot here. On the horizontal axis, we have time and generation. So this is the evolutionary process. Each point in this plot represents a single robot, and you'll see that there are certain colored lines, and those correspond to lineages. So grandparent, parent, child, grandchild, and so on. You'll notice that evolution in this case makes marked improvement for the first 100 generations and then basically stalls out. There's no further evolutionary innovation for the remaining 6,900 generations. And it seems the reason for this is that often there are changes made to the morphology, but those changes are catastrophic in the short term, and there is no time before that robot is deleted to determine whether that morphological change was actually an opportunity given the right controller. This is the situation when you protect morphology, and you'll see the change that occurs here. It's pretty dramatic. So when we protect morphological innovations, even after more than 6,000 generations, this was running for several weeks on NASA's Pleiades supercomputer. So this was a huge amount of computational effort, and the evolutionary algorithm is still innovating. It's still discovering new robots with new bodies that move in different ways and do better than any robot that had been seen in the population up to that time. You see some very interesting ecological dynamics going on in this population. Remember that each colored line here represents a lineage or species, if you like, within that population. In this little zoomed in inset, you'll see that there's this lineage of red dinosaurs, which are getting better and better over time. And at some point during this evolutionary process, there are these light blue mammal robots that appear. When these light blue robots first appear, they move much slower than the dinosaur robots. But those mammals are experiencing, again, quote unquote mammals, they're experiencing some morphological changes and then corresponding control changes that take advantage of these changing morphologies, so that eventually the mammals are moving faster than the dinosaurs, and the dinosaur species dies out here. So some very interesting evolutionary dynamics. So just to wrap up here, again, as I mentioned, one of the things that I find fascinating about evolutionary algorithms, or evolution in general, is their ability to stack timescales of adaptation one on top of each other. It's hard to see in this picture, but there are actually at least 3 timescales going on here. There's the overall evolutionary process itself. If you think about the top curves in this plot, that's evolutionary change. Within any one species, there is adaptation going on to the morphologies and control policies of robots in that species. Any one of those robots is experiencing developmental change, like the walking and rolling robots that you saw. So any individual robot is changing its body and possibly exhibiting different ways of moving over its lifetime. We could add learning in here. Again, as I mentioned, some people are embedding reinforcement learning inside of evolutionary algorithms. So we could have faster synaptic plasticity going on at the very short term, and so on. So one of the things that I've taken away from the work we've done in my group over the last few years, and from some other groups, is the power of combining adaptation that occurs at different temporal scales. So I think with that, I will finish up there. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. Great talk, and we open the space for questions. So yeah, it was also kind of great. Yeah. All right, so we have one question coming.
Okay. I apologize I couldn't be there in person today, but given the snow we have here in Vermont and probably down there is would have been difficult drive.
To plan for their summer school.
That's right. There you go.
So my question is, do you believe that humans possess embodied knowledge? And what are your, I guess, can you just comment on that? And do you think robots will possess embodied knowledge? And is embodied knowledge what makes humans human?
That's a great question, and it would take a better part of a year to answer it. I have my own beliefs, but there's some interesting neuroscience experiments in the last few years that seem to suggest there are deep connections between felt physical experiences, and abstract thought. The primary author is Pulver Muller, and I could probably dig up the citation for those that are interested. They put a bunch of human subjects in an fMRI machine, and they just listened to fiction. They just read them short stories. The subjects are completely still. And what they found is that not only what was previously thought of as the language part of the brain, but the motor strip also lights up. So as the subjects are listening to stories about human actions and human interactions, as far as we know, we are also mentally simulating those situations. So those experiments suggest there is a deep connection between embodiment, motor experience, and motor imagery, our ability to imagine actions performed by others and what those others would experience if they performed those actions, and thought, or abstract thought, in this case, recognizing language. I think there's a deep connection there. George Lakoff, a very well-known linguist, has written about this idea for a long time. He proposed the idea of embodied metaphors. So, for example, if you're having a conversation with someone and English is not their first language, and you tell them not to jump to conclusions, even if they've never heard that English idiom before, most non-English speakers can figure out what that metaphor means. And according to Lakoff, the reason why they can do so is because they have some embodied understanding of what jump means. They understand the literal interpretation of jump, what it feels like to jump, but also sort of the abstract aspect of it. When you jump, you are jumping over, you are missing some material in between. So if you challenge someone not to jump to conclusions in the middle of an argument, they can understand what that means the first time. So that suggests not only that there is a link between embodiment and cognition or thinking, but also that we use that. It is a necessary component of language understanding. As I showed you with the Twitch robots here, they have a very rudimentary ability to ground language in their experience. So they also have a very limited embodied understanding. One of the questions we're focusing on now in the lab is how close does the embodied grounding of robots match that of humans? Our robots at the moment clearly will not understand what a human means if they say don't jump to conclusions, but they do know what jump means, and to them it means something close to what it means to a human, but not quite the same. So how do we actually close that gap between the bindings, the language bindings for humans and for machines? It's a great question. Thank you.
Another question, please.
Thank you very much for your talk. So I got my dissertation. I did my dissertation with Mark Johnson, Lakoff Johnson.
Okay.
And so I think what we're getting at here is in terms of image schema and image schemata, and how that can be related to our notions around metaphor, but also in regards to Fauconier's notion of conceptual blending. Maybe, do you think that there might be any possibility for conceptual blending in this regard, how you were just describing it, to be applied to robotics in this regard?
That's a great question. I'm not familiar with that concept. I think what I'm trying to show here is that there are ways using modern technologies and robotics to try and operationalize our questions about that. How would we actually conduct an experiment around that idea? So thank you very much for that comment. I'd be happy to follow up with you after that. I'm not familiar with conceptual blending.
Good. Next to Hiroki, you have a question.
Oh yeah, just a quick question. Just a technical question. In the last example, you mentioned that you had two different CTPM, one for the body, the other for the brain, right?
I'm afraid that the audio is degrading a little bit on my side.
Can you hear me now? I'm coming closer to the.
That's better. Thank you, Hiroki. Do you mind repeating?
Yeah. Yeah, so what I said was that in the last part of the talk, you presented the work where you have two different CPPNs, one for the morphology, the other for the control.
Yes.
Do you still need two of them separately, or can you generate both of them from the single CPPN?
So we've tried that, and as you can imagine from this experiment, we haven't had success with doing that for the reason that there seems to be something different about morphology and control, that at least in these experiments, it facilitates evolution if evolution is able to alter one and not alter the other. So presumably there is a cleverer genotype to phenotype mapping that either includes CPPNs or moves beyond CPPNs that allows evolution to induce the right modularity on its own. In these experiments, the relevant modularity, at least that we've discovered so far, is separate geometry and material properties from the control policy. But again, that's a design decision that we made. Ultimately, you would like evolution to discover those modular systems on its own. But we're not there yet, and obviously a lot of people are looking at the evolution of modularity, and that would be useful here for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so one last question. So I have a question.
Yep.
Since you are also in the winter school in the middle of agent-based modeling and
I'm sorry, my audio is getting really bad.
So I go straight to the question. What in terms of going from in that arrow to general intelligence using embodiment and agents and robots, what's the role of swarms and how can collective of robots achieve more intelligence or better capabilities than robots in isolation?
I'm sorry, Alfred. My apologies. Couldn't hear the question.
Yeah. So what would be the benefit towards creating general artificial intelligence of using swarms, robotics, and collective of robots instead of robots in isolation?
That's a great question. I think, here we have sort of robots that are made up of these voxels, and we're making the assumption that they're permanently physically connected to one another. If we relax that assumption, we can obviously view the swarm as a whole as a particular form of morphology. So I think swarms are fantastic because they make it easier for the system itself to reconfigure into different forms. So it'd be interesting to recapitulate some of these experiments we've done on altering morphology and control within a swarm setting. I think there's lots of interesting work that could be done there for sure.
Perfect.